Of course, this title is clickbait. You already know that a YouTube video can't tell you how to write a bestseller or a classic, but it is a topic that I've been pondering lately, particularly the urge to write something that stands the test of time and is very successful, something meaningful, something that touches the souls of all who read it, or at least 25% of them. Hello friends, I'm Lydia Foxglove, and I am a fantasy author. If you're new here, welcome, and if you're a regular, welcome back. My cats, as usual, are making a lot of noise in the background. I was traditionally published, and then I moved into a generally successful self-published career. But my self-published books have tended to be written more to trends of the moment, which left me with a certain level of guilt, thinking that I was wasting my talents, not really trying to write a great work. There are books that have inspired me deeply throughout my life, books I've reread many times. And it is the dream to write one of those books that people read until it falls apart. But that always brings me to the question, how do you write a book that people read until it falls apart? Is it possible to have any effect on whether a book stands the test of time? Spoiler alert, I don't think so, but that doesn't stop me from getting in my head about it. Many books that are popular across the ages, of course, have wonderful characters. They are who we connect with. Perhaps we see some of ourselves in them, or perhaps they hit us with a gut punch of some truth of human nature. So I always think, in order to write a great work, I need to really know the characters deeply. And I have characters that I've spent so much time with that they feel like real people to me. So whenever I'm writing about them, I feel like I'm doing a better job at writing the great work. And yet, those books have never done very well because they're not written to trend. So nobody buys them in the first place. So then you circle back to writing trends again, just to get someone, anyone, to pick up the book in the first place. And in the process, you may lose some of your original vision. That feels like a bummer because you think, I'm not going to write a classic unless it brings something original to the table, right? Well, maybe. Many popular classics do have an element of originality in them, but sometimes not so much. Look at something like Harry Potter. There were other magical school books before Harry Potter came along. There were certainly plenty of books about orphans who were the chosen one. There were plenty of old wizards dispensing advice and wisdom. The basic elements of that book are not very unique. So perhaps originality is not that special after all. Maybe what makes a book memorable is in fact the details. When you think of A Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I know some of the things I remember the most are the wardrobe and the lamppost, Mr. Tumnus's little house, and Turkish Delight. In fact, the story kind of takes a back seat to those tiny little details. And many beloved classics have tiny little details that stick out. So in fact, maybe the broad original idea is not important. Maybe the idea is simply that you need those little details that make the world feel well realized and lived in. Perhaps you can even write something that is quite trendy, but elevates itself with good characters and well thought out little details. But you should definitely aim for impressive prose, right? Maybe. Lord of the Rings certainly has some beautiful writing, and a lot of the classics, the literary classics, when you think of Hemingway or F. Scott Fitzgerald, you're more likely to think of prose and theme as much as you are to think of the characters or the tiny details. So there's something to be said for having beautiful prose, strong prose, really clear prose, page-turning prose. But then page-turning prose isn't necessarily good. When I Googled classic books with bad writing, one of the first things that came up was a thread talking about how The Godfather was terrible. I actually loved The Godfather. I read it in like one day. It was one of those leave me alone, I'm reading this kind of books. But was the writing good, or was it just gripping? And are those different things? So ultimately, it seems like having some of those elements is important. Good writing, or strong, powerful themes, or great characters, or a well-realized world with wonderful little details. But maybe you don't need all of those things. There are so many different ways to write a story that resonates and stands the test of time that trying to decide what the secret sauce is, what your secret sauce is going to be, will drive you insane. So back to me writing trendy commercial fiction and feeling kind of bad about it. I have a feeling I'm not the only one to experience a certain level of insecurity about the entire concept of writing, really, whether it's writing for a living or just taking precious time out of your life to write stories. At some point you may be seized with a sense of, is there any point to this? I have these stories that mean so much to me. I haven't spent most of my career writing them, but that's another story. I do have stories that have my entire heart and soul and being invested in them. But when I look at them, I'm also like, they have great characters. They have some great details. I like to think they have some good themes. But they're also like kind of romancy stories. There's like pretty men and tragic pasts and dragons and like cool magic. Does this really contribute anything to the canon of literature? Or am I just like a fanfic writer for myself? Sometimes I feel like, do I really have anything to say? Do I have anything to contribute? Who am I to spend my life working on a story about like a hot king and dragons, maybe a little melodrama? Like, come back when you've escaped a war zone or something. Who am I? Who cares? And does any of that matter at all? I'm getting very existential here. But then when I think about the books that have stood the test of time in a big way, a lot of them are about very sad men. And we do know that culture values men writing about men suffering more than it values women writing about the domestic sphere or, God forbid, a happy marriage. Is it really any more self-indulgent for a man to write about a man being sad or angry than it is for a woman to write about family or social mores, or even to write about happiness? All of these things are very much a part of the human experience. And yet, certainly, Pride and Prejudice has been one of the most enduring novels of our time. It's very impressive to me that all of Jane Austen's novels are still widely read. And I'm quite sure that Jane did not write them thinking, I bet people are still going to be reading my books in 200 years. And then she died without ever knowing that she was Jane Austen, which I think about constantly. There are so many novels written in the 19th century about marriages, families, class issues, what have you. And if you've ever been delighted by a Jane Austen novel, I don't have to tell you the appeal of them. They have a certain sparkle. They hold up to this day. The characters are wonderfully realized. They're witty. They're insightful. But at the same time, I wonder, was Jane Austen the only person capable of doing such a good job with this type of novel? Or is there some other Jane Austen that just didn't end up getting remembered? Someone who's been lost to the ages? I can see it being equally possible that Jane Austen just happened to be gifted with the perfect set of traits to stand the test of time. And also possible that there is some wonderful novel that no one's really going to ever remember or realize was as good as it is. Maybe it was never even published. And it's not like in Jane Austen's own lifetime, when she was actually living in the times that she was writing about, she never rose to this level of fame. She sold some books. Some of them sold decently well. A few prominent people read them, which I'm sure must have pleased her very much at the time. And then she died. And then over the course of ages, she became Jane Austen. Another thing I think about sometimes are those commercial authors that have really large catalogs. Someone like Isaac Asimov, who was really prolific, had a ton of books, fiction, nonfiction, short stories, you name it. Isaac Asimov wrote it. His books are still pretty popular. People ask for them at the bookstore. If we get one in, it usually sells, unless it's some nonfiction topic that's no longer very pertinent. However, the one that always sells the best is Foundation. And I'm sure part of that is because there's an Apple TV series of Foundation right now, but also I think partly why they made the TV series is because Foundation was already popular. So I find it likely that in another 50 years, people are probably not going to be reading as much of the entire Asimov catalog, but they might still be reading Foundation. Sort of like how you maybe know the names of all the works by the Bronte sisters, possibly, but you probably haven't read them all. Most people have read perhaps Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. After that, the likelihood that you have read a Bronte novel goes down considerably. I read Charlotte Bronte's Shirley, and that was like some kind of punishment to myself. Maybe it had more relevance at the time that it was published, but when I was like 14 or however old I was when I read it, what was I doing? I had too much free time. There are a lot of other prolific science fiction authors who were very big at the time. You might still know their names loosely if you follow sci-fi at all, but you might not have read any of their books. They are no longer as popular. And is it because Asimov was a better writer, or was it because he happened to have a couple of stories that really stuck out that people kept seeking out? Or was it just kind of the luck of the draw of whether there were movie adaptations or TV, particularly good movie or TV adaptations, or whether culture evolves and the book stays relevant or becomes even more relevant than when it was published. And I should mention that I often in my head feel like I should be writing both a current best-selling popular book and a classic that people will be reading in the year 2300. Aiming for either one of these things is probably very silly, but aiming for both is almost impossible. Like A Court of Thorns and Roses is a very popular book in our current era. Is it still going to be popular in 100 years? My bet is on no. I'm going to put up a list of the best-selling books of 1924. Let me know in the comments how many of those you have read. I've only ever heard of half of these authors, and not a single one of these books. Apparently The Little French Girl was so popular that it was also on the bestseller list for 1925. And basically I looked at the list of all the bestsellers of the 1920s, and there's only a very few that I would say are still widely read. Most of them I haven't heard of. There's like All Quiet on the Western Front. Of course, this list doesn't include children's books, which are often the most enduring, but still. It's quite common that the book that perfectly fits the time it is published does not endure culturally, whereas many beloved books become popular decades later. Culture changes, certain types of stories become more appreciated. I think you have to usually have a certain level of success upon publication just for people to be aware of it, but it could be fairly small. So I work at a used bookstore, and the entire time that I've worked there, people are always asking for Octavia Butler. Octavia Butler has never been as popular as she is now. I feel so bad for her because I've read about how she just really believed in herself and that she was going to be a success. And it breaks my heart that she actually was, but she didn't really live to see like the full flower of her career. But anyway, our culture has changed, and we have a lot of factors contributing to Octavia Butler going from someone whose name was known and who received some acclaim in sales, but was not like the pillar of science fiction that she's starting to become in our modern era. We have more women reading science fiction. We have a more diverse society. We have more people reading outside of their race, culture, gender, I think, than we used to have. We have more elevating of the voices of Black women in culture. Also, the themes that she wrote about remain very culturally relevant to this day. Another author that's popular at the bookstore now is Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson certainly enjoyed success in her lifetime, but I think she's probably as popular as she's ever been after like a lull period. And there are some similar reasons, I think. She wrote about themes that have remained relevant. And I think people are even more interested about a woman who had a very domestic mid-century life, but was writing some very weird, sometimes twisted horror fiction. As a culture, I think we are really appreciating that dichotomy now more than ever. So I think both Butler and Jackson just hit differently now. So where am I going with all this? The point that I want to make, and this is something that I'm trying to think myself, as well as hoping that it might be helpful for some of you, is that I think it's just really important to write the books that call to you, maybe even just the books that you need to write to make money. I think it's really important to write the books that call to you, even if they feel a little self-indulgent or silly at times, if they don't feel like they're necessarily what you're capable of, but they're what you want to write, because you don't really know where a powerful theme or a character that's going to resonate with people will emerge, and you also don't know where culture is going in the future. It could be that people of the future appreciate different things than we appreciate now, and that something that's only minorly successful now is going to be huge in the future. Perhaps you really love literary fiction, and you got a bachelor's in English, and you got an MFA, and you genuinely love classic literature, and you love like really beautiful literary prose. But the work that you're working on is like a cute little romance about lesbians running an adoption agency for baby dragons. Something in your head is like, I'm capable of more than that. That sounds kind of silly, but it's just something that I write because it's fun. I'm here to give you permission to write whatever calls to you. Whether it is yet another broody vampire or a horror novel that just reminds you of books you read under the covers when you were 12. Even if you want to write a literary novel about a sad man suffering, if that's what calls to you, there's always room for another one. Don't feel bad about writing something that just feels like you, and don't get too in your head about whether it is a great work or not. If you're going to devote some of your time, your one precious life, to writing, then I think the last thing we should be worrying about is whether it's important or whether it will be a classic or a bestseller, much less both, which, as we've established, is extremely rare. You have no idea what will resonate with people 50 or 100 years from now, and you don't know what will resonate with people now. It might be that you die not knowing that you were Jane Austen. But aren't we so glad that Jane Austen just was Jane Austen without knowing she was Jane Austen? And the other point I want to make is, if you need to write something for money, as I have done, it doesn't mean that that book won't mean something to people as well. You really have no clue how long a book will last, or what kind of long-term relevance or popularity it will have, or whether it will just hit someone a certain way at a certain time in their life. There are entire categories of creations like pulp science fiction or superhero comics that were kind of treated as throwaway amusements when they first came out, and now have a much more elevated place in our culture. So it's also possible that A Court of Thorns and Roses will in fact be more popular in 50 years, and that people will be getting their Sarah Moss books graded and encased in plastic. I don't know. There are also books that never become classics in a broad sense, but have a small group of people who love them. Or there's books that really influenced someone when they came out, so they might not have been known themselves, but some other great artist would never have been what they were without that work. I think all of these things are important, and that art is just this big web and conversation, and that you can drive yourself crazy trying to decide where you fit into it. So write what you love, write what you need to write to be able to keep on writing, and don't worry about tests of time or bestseller lists. I would love to know if this is something that you ever struggle with in your head. Maybe I'm kind of inventing this entire problem and it's just me, but I've had this conversation in the comments with a few people already, so I thought it was worth kind of making a whole video essay about. And if you've watched to the end, thank you so much. I really hope some of this resonated with you. And if you want more from me, you can always join either my Substack or my Patreon, where I have a free weekly Q&A, as well as a $5 Patreon that gets you access to my Discord server, where I have been quite active, and bonus videos. I wish you all the best in all of your creative endeavors, and I will see you next time. Bye.